December 1944. Western Europe is freezing. Fuel is rationed. Roads are jammed with refugees. And the largest German counteroffensive of the war has just smashed through the Ardennes. In the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, Allied command teeters on the edge of fracture. Communications are down. Entire American divisions are cut off. Patton's Third Army is racing north in one of the most daring maneuvers of the war. And in this moment, when unity matters more than pride, one Allied commander walks unannounced into Supreme Headquarters. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery does not come to advise. He comes to demand. He wants command of all American ground forces north of the Bulge, Bradley's armies, Patton's momentum, and the future direction of the war in Europe. What follows is not shouted. It is not dramatic, but it is one of the most decisive leadership moments of World War II. Because Eisenhower already knows something Montgomery does not, and with a single decision made quietly, deliberately, America's role in the alliance changes forever. By late 1944, the Allied coalition was winning, but it was not harmonious. Britain had entered the war 5 years earlier, battered but experienced. Its generals had survived Dunkirk, North Africa, and Italy. The United States, by contrast, had arrived late, but arrived with overwhelming force. By December 1944, American factories were producing tanks, trucks, aircraft, fuel, and ammunition on a scale the world had never seen. Nearly 2/3 of Allied forces in Northwest Europe were now American. And yet, Supreme Command still rested on balance, political, not just military. Eisenhower was chosen precisely because he was not a battlefield general. He was a coalition manager, a diplomat in uniform. Montgomery never lacked that. To him, command belonged to experience, and he believed British experience outweighed American numbers. That belief would soon collide with reality. Bernard Montgomery was not a reckless man. He believed in method, preparation, overwhelming force at a single point. That philosophy had served him well at El Alamein in 1942, where he defeated Rommel and became Britain's most celebrated general. But by September 1944, Montgomery's reputation had begun to crack. Operation Market Garden, his bold plan to end the war by Christmas, collapsed spectacularly. Airborne troops were stranded, bridges were missed, intelligence warnings were dismissed. Over 17,000 Allied casualties were suffered for no strategic gain. American commanders quietly questioned his judgment. Montgomery, however, reached a different conclusion. He believed the failure proved the Americans were too aggressive, too impatient, too willing to gamble lives. And when the German Ardennes offensive erupted in December, Montgomery saw not a disaster, but an opportunity. At dawn on December 16, 1944, Hitler launched his last great gamble. Over 200,000 German troops smashed into thin American lines in the Ardennes, aiming to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Weather grounded Allied aircraft, snow blinded reconnaissance, communications collapsed. Entire American divisions were encircled. To prevent catastrophe, Eisenhower made a temporary, practical decision. American forces north of the Bulge, cut off from Bradley,
were placed under Montgomery's operational control. It was not a promotion. It was not a reward. It was a stopgap. Montgomery, however, interpreted it very differently. Within days, he would walk into Eisenhower's office, convinced that the crisis had proven his point, and that supreme command should now be his. The visit was not scheduled. In late December 1944, Field Marshal Montgomery arrived as Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force without prior notice. He asked to see Eisenhower immediately. This alone was unusual. Montgomery was not Eisenhower's subordinate. He was a national commander, accountable directly to London. Protocol mattered, and Montgomery ignored it. Inside the office, Montgomery laid out his case calmly, almost clinically. The American front, he argued, had collapsed under German pressure. British command experience was superior. Unity of control, he insisted, required a single ground commander. That commander, he made clear, should be him. He did not ask for expanded coordination. He did not request temporary authority. He demanded permanent operational control over all American ground forces engaged in the crisis. Eisenhower listened and said almost nothing. Montgomery did not believe he was overreaching. In British military culture, seniority and experience carried enormous weight. Montgomery had commanded armies while many American generals were still colonels. He also believed, correctly, that Eisenhower feared Allied disunity more than personal insult. Montgomery had leverage. Britain still held political prestige. Churchill still sat beside Roosevelt as an equal, and Eisenhower had already placed American forces under Montgomery's control once. In Montgomery's mind, the logic was simple. The Americans had numbers, but not judgment. They moved too fast, took risks, trusted speed over preparation. If Eisenhower truly wanted stability, Montgomery believed, he would have no choice. What Montgomery failed to understand was that the balance of power inside the alliance had already shifted, not on the battlefield, but in Washington.
Eisenhower did not confront Montgomery. He did not argue doctrine. He did not raise his voice. Instead, he delayed. Eisenhower understood something Montgomery did not. The crisis was already passing. Patton's Third Army was breaking through from the south. German fuel shortages were becoming critical. The Bulge was narrowing. Time, not debate, would decide this issue. Eisenhower thanked Montgomery for stabilizing the northern front, and then, quietly, he asked his staff to draft a message, not to Montgomery, but to Washington. It would be brief, it would be formal, and once sent, it would make Montgomery's demand impossible without firing a single shot. On December 28, 1944, Eisenhower sent a secure cable to General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. The message did not accuse Montgomery. It did not complain. It simply stated the facts. Eisenhower explained that Montgomery had proposed assuming permanent control of American ground forces, and then Eisenhower asked a single question. Was he still expected to command or not? This was the trap, because once the question was asked, Washington had only one answer. The United States had committed millions of men, thousands of ships, and an industrial output unmatched in history. Supreme command was not negotiable. Montgomery had appealed to hierarchy. Eisenhower had appealed to sovereignty.
On January 7th, 1945, Bernard Montgomery held a press conference in Brussels. It was intended to be a victory briefing. Montgomery described how his methodical planning had stabilized the Northern Front during the Battle of the Bulge. He spoke at length about British control, British patience, and British judgment. American commanders were mentioned only in passing. Patton's rapid counterattack was minimized. Bradley's role was reduced to administration. Montgomery did not criticize the Americans directly. He did something worse. He implied that the crisis had required British leadership to correct American failure. Correspondence immediately understood the subtext. By nightfall, the story had crossed the Atlantic.
The reaction inside the American command was immediate and furious. General Omar Bradley called the remarks careless and insulting. Patton was less restrained, writing privately that Montgomery had nearly lost the war and now wanted the credit for saving it. American soldiers were still fighting in the snow. Thousands were dead or wounded. To suggest their sacrifice required British correction struck a nerve. Eisenhower was urged repeatedly to relieve Montgomery of command. Congressmen began asking questions. Newspapers questioned Allied unity. Eisenhower refused every demand. Instead, he waited. Because Washington had now replied. General George Marshall's response was clear. Supreme command in Europe rested with Eisenhower and would remain there. No American forces would be permanently transferred to foreign control. The message was polite, but it was absolute. Eisenhower now held something Montgomery could not countermand: political authority backed by industrial power. From this moment forward, Montgomery's role was defined, not expanded. He would command British forces. He would coordinate with Americans, but he would not command them. Eisenhower had not defeated Montgomery publicly. He had rendered the question irrelevant.
When Winston Churchill learned what had happened, he was alarmed. Britain depended on American manpower, fuel, and logistics. The war could not be won without them. Montgomery's press conference had jeopardized that relationship. Privately, Churchill acknowledged the danger. The alliance was no longer balanced on sentiment or shared history. It was balanced on resources. Britain could not afford to alienate the United States, not in 1945. Churchill ordered damage control. Montgomery was instructed to issue a clarification. It was too late. The shift in leadership had already occurred.
By mid-January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was effectively over. German forces were retreating. Allied momentum had returned. Montgomery remained in command, but diminished. Eisenhower had preserved unity without humiliation. Montgomery had preserved rank but lost influence. And still, Eisenhower had not answered Montgomery's original demand directly. Not in public, not in writing, but the answer existed. It would be delivered quietly. And when Eisenhower finally spoke, it would define not just command, but the future of the Western Alliance. In mid-January 1945, Eisenhower finally addressed the controversy. Not in a press conference, not in a confrontation, but in a private meeting with senior American commanders.
Eisenhower acknowledged Montgomery's role in stabilizing the Northern Front. Then he made his position unmistakably clear. Coalition warfare, Eisenhower said, required cooperation, but not surrender of command. American forces would fight alongside allies. They would accept coordination, but they would never again be subordinated as a matter of prestige. It was not an emotional statement. It was administrative, and that was precisely why it mattered.
Eisenhower's words were later summarized by those present. He did not insult Montgomery. He did not question British courage. He said only this, that American soldiers answered to American commanders, and that responsibility for their lives could not be delegated. The statement was simple. It closed the issue permanently. Montgomery never again raised the question. Eisenhower had not asserted dominance. He had asserted accountability. And in coalition warfare, accountability is authority. Montgomery issued a clarification days later. He praised American bravery. He emphasized unity, but the moment had passed. His influence within Allied command never fully recovered. British forces would continue to fight with distinction, but strategic direction now flowed unmistakably from Eisenhower. Montgomery had mistaken temporary necessity for permanent leverage, and in doing so, he revealed the limits of Britain's post-war power. In the final months of the war, American operational doctrine proved decisive. Speed, logistics, relentless pressure across a broad front. Patton's advances, Bradley's coordination, and Eisenhower's strategic restraint crushed German resistance. British forces played a vital role, but no longer dictated tempo. The war in Europe ended not with a single decisive battle, but with sustained industrial and operational dominance. The center of gravity had shifted, quietly, irreversibly. The confrontation between Eisenhower and Montgomery was never about ego alone. It marked a transition from empire to alliance, from tradition to capacity. Eisenhower understood something Churchill did as well. The future would belong to nations that could sustain power, economically, militarily, and morally. Britain had led with courage. America now led with capability. Eisenhower did not announce this shift. He simply acted accordingly, and history followed. Inside Allied headquarters, the episode left a lasting impression. No official reprimand was issued, no public rebuke followed, but among senior commanders, the conclusion was clear. Montgomery had crossed a line, not of legality, but of trust. Bradley never again supported expanding British authority. Patton, though reckless in temperament, was now viewed as strategically indispensable. Eisenhower's restraint elevated his standing. He had absorbed pressure from every direction: British pride, American anger, political scrutiny, and emerged stronger. The crisis had tested the coalition and revealed who could be trusted to hold it together. Bernard Montgomery would go on to be celebrated in Britain as a national hero. His victories were real. His discipline saved lives. But after the winter of 1944-45, his influence within multinational command was limited. The age of unilateral authority, based on seniority or empire, was ending. Future wars would be fought by coalitions led through logistics, coordination, and shared accountability.
Montgomery was a general of the old world. Eisenhower was a commander of the new one. History would remember both, but only one model would endure. The confrontation over command in December 1944 did not end the war, but it shaped the peace. When NATO was formed years later, the lesson was remembered. Coalitions could not function on prestige alone. Leadership required contribution, responsibility, and trust. Eisenhower, later Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, applied the same principle. Allies would be respected, but command would reflect capacity. The moment Montgomery walked into Eisenhower's office, believing authority could be demanded, marked the moment it became clear that the world had changed, quietly, permanently. Winston Churchill never publicly rebuked Montgomery, but privately he understood what had happened. Britain's strength now lay not in commanding allies, but in sustaining partnership. The United States had supplied the men, the machines, the fuel, and the momentum that made victory inevitable. Churchill adjusted accordingly. In meetings with Roosevelt and later Truman, he emphasized unity, not hierarchy. The empire that had once dictated terms now negotiated them. It was not humiliation, it was adaptation, and it allowed Britain to remain relevant in a world it could no longer dominate alone.
When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Allied command structure dissolved, but the principles forged under pressure endured. Command would be based on responsibility, leadership would reflect contribution, and coalitions would survive only if managed with restraint. Eisenhower emerged from the war respected not for brilliance on the battlefield, but for judgment under strain. He had proven that power did not require theatrics, only clarity.
Eisenhower never published a memoir attacking Montgomery. He never quoted the confrontation verbatim, but those present remembered the essence of what he said. That unity was not submission, that cooperation did not mean abdication, and that American soldiers could never be placed under command without accountability to their own nation. It was not a speech, it was a boundary. Once drawn, it was never crossed again.
History often remembers battles. It rarely remembers restraint, but restraint can decide wars just as surely. Eisenhower understood that leadership in coalitions depends not on dominance, but on knowing when to say no and how. Montgomery sought authority. Eisenhower exercised responsibility. One approach shaped the past, the other shaped the future.
When Montgomery walked into Eisenhower's office in December 1944, he believed command could be claimed. Eisenhower believed command had to be earned and justified. The difference mattered, not just for the Battle of the Bulge, but for the world that followed. This was the moment the United States became the senior partner of the Western Alliance, not by force, not by proclamation, but by responsibility. And that may be Eisenhower's greatest victory of all.
History is not only shaped by battles, but by decisions made quietly behind closed doors. If you value carefully researched World War II documentaries grounded in primary sources, declassified records, and honest historical analysis, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps keep these stories accurate, respectful, and available for future generations. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering history as it truly happened.